Hey everyone, Pastor Tim here. And 100 years ago, on May 31st, in this country, we experienced a horrific event. It's now known as the Tulsa Race Riots. And our good friend Tim Madigan has written a book about it. Now, some of you remember Tim. Tim wrote the book, I'm Proud of You, My Friendship with Fred Rogers. And he came and he spoke at our church a few years ago. Before he wrote that book, he wrote a book called The Burning, and it's about the Tulsa Race Riots. And I did a Zoom interview with him on that book and that event several months ago, and we were going to use it in February during Black History Month. But I thought since we were coming up to the 100th anniversary of that event, that we would save the video for then. And so we're going to show it to you today, and that's why I'm giving you a little intro, because some of the things may sound like we recorded it quite a while ago, and we did. But I think you're going to find this is a fascinating story. And so here's our good friend, Tim Madigan.
Hey everyone, Pastor Tim here, and I am back with my good friend Tim Madigan. We've had Tim to our church live, and we've done some Zoom things with him, usually around his book on Mr. Rogers. And we're turning to a very different kind of book, but no less important. And Tim, first of all, thanks for being with us. It's so good to have you here.
It's good to see you, and hello everyone. I know have very fond memories of being out there, and I hope to see you again soon.
So we're at the time of recording, we're still in COVID, so we're kind of locked down, and this works out just perfectly. Because no offense to Tim, it's a lot cheaper for me to Zoom him than to church. And so what we want to talk about is really a very, very important book about a historic event that took place in our country almost 100 years ago now. I'm going to hold the book up for you, and it's going to be backwards, but I just want you to see he's actually written a book, and it's called The Burning. All right, The Burning, Massacre, Destruction, and the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. And Tim, you wrote this book back in the early 2000s, I believe.
I did, yes.
And the book is about a horrific moment in our history back in 1921 that has not been talked about much. It was sort of covered over, even though it was this huge story. And your book and other things like it are bringing it to light. And now that we're coming up on the 100th anniversary, it's a very important story because it's about us as human beings. It's about us as Americans. And it's about us and this ongoing issue with racism. So first of all, I want to ask you, how did you come to write this book on this particular story? And then we'll dive into the story a little bit.
Well, the backstory to me is very important because I was born and raised in a small town in northern Minnesota, no black people.
Right.
And by the time I got to Texas, where I live now, and started to live and work among people who are different than me, issues of race just weren't on my radar. They weren't relevant at all. Mostly because I was so preoccupied with feathering my own nest that, I'm self-absorbed as we tend to be when we're younger. But anyway, one day in the year 2000, my boss, my editor at the Fort Worth paper comes by my desk and hands me a printout of a wire story from Oklahoma, something that what was called the Oklahoma Race Riot Commission was doing. And so I read this article, and I read it, and it said in May, late May, early June 1921, there was this horrible thing where a white mob of thousands of white people basically attacked a very prosperous African-American community and destroyed it. And up to 300 people were killed, 35 square blocks were burned to the ground, 10,000 people homeless. And I looked at my boss that day and I said, this can't be true. Nothing this horrible could possibly have happened without us knowing it. Anyway, it was true. And she sent me to Tulsa to do a newspaper story about it. And I interviewed, at that time, there were several survivors who are still living, and did a piece that ran in the year 2000 that ran under the headline, Tulsa's Terrible Secret. Subsequent to that, I got an opportunity to write a book about it based on a newspaper story. And so I spent a year, this white boy from Minnesota spent a year immersing himself in our race history. And what I learned was that for the first time, because again, it was oblivious, willfully so, about our race history. And for the first time I learned about what happened in Tulsa, but not only that, but that event was perfectly consistent with what was going on in our nation at the time, and unique only in its scope. I learned about Jim Crow, I learned about lynching, I learned about racial violence all over the country, I learned about separate restrooms and drinking fountains and back of the bus and on and on and on. And in learning that, it changed my heart. Mm. It changed the way I looked at other people. And so my theory from that time until now is that there are millions and millions of white people like myself, people of goodwill with good hearts, who, if they only could go back and look at what happened in the beginning, that they would have a similar experience to me. And people who have read the book, especially now in this year when there's been so much talk and pain over systematic racism and racism generally. And over and over again, white people, especially, have read the book, have had a very similar experience that I had, as you did, I think.
Yes.
I had no idea that this happened, and reading about it really changed me.
Yeah.
And there's nothing is going to change, and it's not a confrontational thing. It's not a political thing. It's a human thing.
Yep.
And it's a very spiritual thing.
Yeah.
I think because all it is simply is just understanding kind of the antecedents and the foundation of the pain we feel today, and as painful as it was for me. It has been remarkable. It has been a remarkably profound and spiritually nourishing experience to know the truth, and to have my eyes opened and look at people who are different than me in a different way. Because I think we're programmed as human beings, subconsciously almost now, to have some sort of fear of the other.
Yes.
And when you can kind of put a little of that fear aside and try to come at it from a place of understanding and compassion instead, then the world changes. And that has been my experience with this story.
So when you said that it was a profound story that really impacted you, it was a profound story as I read it. And I found myself at times almost weeping at just the heartache of that story, and just scratching my head saying, how did we get to that point, which is a whole different story.
And yet to see that this story has a way of saying to us, especially those of us who are white people, we don't have to be like this. This isn't who we are.
Right.
We can work together, make something happen. So what I want to do is kind of give people an overview, because I really want people to read the book. And for me, it was, for my own particular journey in racism, what's been most helpful for me are the stories of what's happened, because our past gives us insights into who we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is a fascinating read, because you write it like a newspaper reporter, which you were, and it's a page turner in the best sense of the word, in that it's a true story that just keeps you moving through. It's littered with all kinds of real people. It's a real story. And before we dive into the story, what's interesting to me is, even though it's going to be like the 100th anniversary coming up next May, June, this is still a story that is in living memory for some people. I'm guessing there are still grandchildren who are alive today whose grandma and grandpa went through this experience. So this isn't all that removed from us. This is our living history. There are people who can still tell stories about this, if not first source, second source.
Yes, and I'm working on a magazine piece for the anniversary of the centennial for Smithsonian Magazine. And so I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of grandchildren of survivors, and the stories that they heard as children from their grandparents, and how that experience has lived in their families generation after generation. So it's very much living history.
Yep.
And again, of course, 20 years ago when I did the book, I talked to 10 or 15 actual survivors. What a blessing. That was an enormous blessing to have that opportunity while they were still alive to sit down with them and hear about what happened.
So let's just give the bird's eye view. Let's start with Greenwood. Tell us about Greenwood.
Greenwood was in Tulsa in the early part of the 19th or the 20th century. There was oil discovered in the area. And it went from this kind of sleepy Native American place to this oil capital almost overnight. It went from a town of a few thousand people to almost 100,000 by 1921, with skyscrapers and lots of wealth. And it was really the boom town in every sense of the word. But one of the things that happened was that white Tulsa took shape on the south side of the tracks. Black Tulsa took shape on the north side of the tracks. And what ended up happening was there became this symbiotic relationship between white and black, where the whites needed chauffeurs and gardeners and cooks and mammies and shoeshine boys and et cetera, et cetera. And so these blacks would come across the tracks every day to go to work. They'd be paid well comparatively. They come back across the tracks and need a place to spend their money. And so this professional class emerged, and theaters and doctors and lawyers and confectionaries, and it became a very vibrant and relatively affluent community, to the extent that Booker T. Washington called it in 1915 the Black Wall Street of America, or the Negro Wall Street of America. And so Greenwood grew up in 35 square blocks, and it became a really amazing success story. But as a lot of African American people would tell you, that a lot of times what happened is when African Americans got ahead, something would happen to put them back behind again.
Yeah.
And
if they got too uppity was the word, right? Uppity.
Well, it wasn't, it almost sounds like a cliche, but if you were a well-to-do black person, by nature, you were uppity. And there's a horrible amount of tension between the sexual tension.
Yes.
Between fear that among whites, the black men were going to do stuff to white women. And so so you've got booming white Tulsa, thriving Greenwood, which is what it came to be called. But these really kind of intense tensions that were living beneath the surface of the community, which certainly weren't limited to Tulsa. It was all over the country, not only just in the South, but in the North as well.
Right. And this is sort of where we see that concept, which has been quite controversial these days, of white supremacy, meaning the white people felt they were superior to the blacks or the Negroes, as they called them then, or that the Negroes were inferior to them. And so anything that would suggest at that time that Negroes were becoming about the same, that's when you're saying there was the pushback because of this sense that whites were superior.
Well, and whites, it was really surprising to me to learn the extent to which that notion was prevalent in the culture.
Yeah.
The white superiority, was that way, and one of the most prominent proponents of that in those years was Woodrow Wilson, and one of the great early movie blockbusters, was this movie called Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
Which was nothing more than a kind of a shameless celebration of the resurgence of the KKK, and invoked the most vile racial stereotypes you can imagine. And Wilson gave it its most enthusiastic endorsement, and it played to cheering crowds across the North and South alike. And in the late teens, early 20s, the most popular Halloween costume was the KKK robe. And it just went on and on. And so there was this thing, and part of what factored into what happened in Tulsa is that something very significant happened in the late teens, which was thousands of African-American men went out to fight in World War I. And they believed, almost to a man, that they were going to go over and die and fight as the whites did. And then finally they would have proven something to white culture. And when they came back to the States, that things would have changed. And unfortunately, what they found too often was that things had only gotten worse. But now these African-American people were much more of a mind that when racial atrocities and racial violence was being attempted to be perpetrated against one of their own, they would be much less likely to just stand by and let it happen.
So the story is populated with real human beings, and you didn't make any of them up, and they're all very, very distinct individuals. They really have their own personalities, and you see, the African-American perspective, you see the white perspective through all of that. So I'm going to start with one name who sort of was the catalyst for all this, and that's Diamond Dick. And tell us a little bit about him and how it is that he was sort of the catalyst that became what was the Tulsa Massacre.
Well, Diamond Dick was Diamond Dick Rowland. He was a young bootblack shoeshine boy who was one of these people who went across tracks every day and made a ton of money shining shoes, because at the time all men tended to be big tippers, and so he'd walk around with wads of cash and bought himself diamond rings and was living the high life. And one day, I think it was September 30th or thereabouts, it was Memorial Day weekend, Roland gets in an elevator in the building where he's shining shoes to ride to the top floor to use the bathroom. And the elevator operator was this young woman named Sarah Page, and it's reputed that the two of them had known each other and might have had some sort of a relationship.
She was a white girl.
She was a white girl. Something happens, maybe the elevator lurches or something. But anyway, next thing you know, Sarah Page is screaming rape or screaming assault, and Dick disappears and takes off, and because that is not what you want to hear when you're a young black. And after, the cops find him and arrest him, but it becomes clear that even the white detectives are very skeptical about these charges. And I think that Roland was probably in jail for his own protection, probably more than anything else. But then there were two white newspapers at the time. And one of them was run by a guy named Richard Lloyd Jones, who is a cousin of what's the famous Frank Lloyd Wright, I think, is the architect. Anyway, the way he was going to try to win this newspaper war was by inflaming racial passions. And so that on September 31st, when most everyone else in town was saying, well, there's probably not much here to see, he writes an editorial in his paper and runs it under the headline, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." And within minutes, crowds had started to form around the courthouse where Dick Rowland was in jail. The sheriff of Tulsa at the time, a guy by the name of McCullough, who I think is one of the heroes of this story, basically said, "Boys, back off. If you want to get to this prisoner, you're gonna have to kill me first." Anyway, so over time, the crowd grows and crowd grows and grows. And meanwhile, a copy of this newspaper makes it back over the tracks to Greenwood. And this fury and this resolve start to build among many of these veterans. And they make 2 trips to the courthouse that night, basically offering their services to the sheriff to protect Dick Rowland. Sheriff says, "I got this, boys. Go back. It's not good that you're here. You're going to inflame things." So they make the first trip, go back. Second trip, probably by accident, a shot is fired. And then all hell breaks loose. And everybody's armed and people of both races die, and they're at the courthouse. And then the blacks retreat back across the railroad tracks. And as soon as that first shot is fired, Dick Rowland becomes an afterthought. Because if you want to talk about an uppity black, a successful black is one thing, but a black who's had the temerity to come across the tracks armed and in the middle of this, that was a whole different thing, and especially when white people had shed blood. So over the course of the night, while the black people braced for what was almost certain to happen, the whites armed themselves. Someone was calling the shots, and no one really knows who. But thousands of white people were stationed at strategic points along Greenwood. And then at 5:08 a.m., there was a shrill whistle that pierced the pre-dawn. And that clearly was the signal to attack. And that's what they did, armed with guns, jugs of kerosene, torches. And for a few hours anyway, they were repelled by the black fighters, but eventually they were overrun, outnumbered, and after that, then it just became scorched earth and kind of a litany of atrocities of people being killed in cold blood, and the National Guard got there by noon, but by that time, the place, as I've often described it, looked like Hiroshima after the bomb.
Yeah. And just to give context, I think you were saying September, but this all happened in May of.
I'm sorry. Yeah, yep. I'm sorry.
1921.
Yeah,
so
May of 1921. Yep. May 31st, 1921, and then the whistle on June 1st, 1921.
So as I was reading this book, I couldn't help but think about Rwanda, because I did a lot of reading about that because I made several trips over there, and a similar kind of thing where the press in Rwanda just kept riling up their supporters with all kinds of disinformation, propaganda, racial stereotypes that motivated people to go out then and slaughter, a million people in 3 months. And this had a similar kind of feel to it with that newspaper in particular, riling up people with false information, racial stereotypes. And the fallout was, tell us again, how many people were killed?
The estimates are up to about 300.
Yeah, 300 African-American people or three?
The vast majority of them. There
Yeah.
might have been a dozen or so whites that died too.
And then they burned down almost the entire town of Greenwood.
They did, and basically the only, with a couple of exceptions, the only structures that were spared were the outhouses, because evidently the mob didn't feel like an outhouse was worth wasting kerosene on.
Right. And then what's just as, I don't want to say fascinating because the story itself is really troubling, but what was interesting afterwards was the way that the townspeople tried to come to terms with what they had done. Part of it was to bury it. Part of it was just this deep, deep shame. And even though the story had some national legs to it for a while, it just got buried for a long, long time because of the shame that so many of the white folks carried over what had happened, because they were friends with some of these African Americans and had employed many of them. And there were also, in your book, there's some stories of heroism as well. But what did you, as you were researching and having to dig through all of these layers of silence and generations and hiding of secrets, what were some of the things that you discovered in trying to tease out this story as people reflected on it years later?
Well, over the years, through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there would be the occasional person who lived through it, often a white person, who wanted to capture contemporary accounts. And so various people did dozens and dozens of interviews, both white and black, who lived through this, which were really important sources for me when I was trying to write about it. But it was also, I think it's important. It was important to me that there are heroic white characters in this story. The sheriff being one, the men who employed African American people and how the lengths to which they took to protect them and house them afterwards, and so there's some very moving humanity, in that too. What happened is you mentioned the national media, and when the New York Times and Houston Chronicle and Chicago Tribune, everybody was in Tulsa in early June of 1921, official Tulsa was very contrite. And they said, this is terrible, we're going to do everything we can to help them rebuild, we were in the wrong. As soon as the spotlight was extinguished, they changed their tune and quickly tried to appropriate that land that had been burned out, and only through legal action were they prevented from doing so. And then, there were postcards that were sent back and forth with this. It said that, there's a certain amount of pride among certain white Tulsans about what happened. It lasted for a while, but official Tulsa knew that they had a horrible PR problem on their hands. And so they basically did everything they could not to talk about it, not to dredge it up. And they were very successful in that. In Greenwood, which rebuilt without any white assistance and became a thriving community once again, they didn't talk about it. One of my favorite sources, a friend of mine now is this guy by the name of Don Ross, who became a state legislator representing Greenwood and helped form the Tulsa Race Riot Commission in the late 1990s. But when he's a teenager, he was in a yearbook class with his teacher, a guy by the name of Bill Williams, who was 16 years old when this happened. They were having this meeting in the spring, and Bill Williams said, "Here, let me tell you what happened this spring of my 16-year-old year." And so he describes this terrible thing, and Don Ross gets up and he says, "Teacher, that can't be right. I have never heard anything about that." And Bill Williams said, "Sit down and shut up." But the next day he brings in scrapbooks of charred corpses and burned out buildings and shows them, and he starts to introduce him to other survivors. And at some point in this, and Don Ross says, "Well, if this is something so terrible, why in the world don't we know about it?" And Williams says, "Well, by now you understand that if you lived through this once, you sure as heck don't want to live through it again." And he said, "Black people will talk to you about this, but they damn sure want to know who you are. And he said, white people are being quiet about it for different reasons. One is that they're ashamed.
Mhm.
Two, that, the statute of limitations for murder, there is none.
Yeah.
And so this thing happened that for half a century, it was like this. It's really a remarkable example of cultural amnesia that I think is, to some extent, I think is true about a lot of our race history, that the truth of it, the ugly truth, the painful truth of it, just has not been taught and not been spoken of really. And so I think that, and again, these are all my theories that I've come to as a white person from northern Minnesota who put this together. And we talk about the civil rights movement, we talk about the Voting Rights Act, we talk about the various things that have happened in our country that obviously steps in the right direction, but I think we haven't started at the beginning. We haven't taken a look at this history. And I watched a movie the other night about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Desmond Tutu was the chairman of it, where after apartheid, and I guess maybe this was Nelson Mandela's idea, but basically the deal is in South Africa, they said, we have lived through a horrible period of time. And to heal, we have to look at the truth. Together, we need to look at the truth. And so everyone in South Africa was given amnesty to come forward and talk about what it is they did or didn't do during apartheid. And those and the American blacks who have been to South Africa basically say that a version of that, it would be much more complicated to do something like that in the United States, but a version of that is what has been missing here. And I think that it could happen in any number of ways. I think, I hope my book is a contribution. There are others. And it's difficult work, but as I said at the beginning, it's been profoundly healing for me. That is my hope for the country more generally.
So again, for me, the takeaway of a book like yours is it reminds us that this is history, but this is sort of woven into our DNA, so to speak. Your history always lives in you. And what's good about this book is the point isn't to shame white people. The point is to sort of help us open our eyes to our collective story as human beings in the United States of America. And my hope is that as people read this book, the same experience for you and for me and for others is sort of a cracking of some of the defensiveness that we might have as white people, and openness to see a story about human beings and what stereotyping and all these things can do. And then to be inspired by the really good white people in this story who took a stand for humanity. Like you said, they're the heroes in this story, and they're the encouragement for us.
I think that I really believe, Tim, that there's something we share as human beings that transcends everything.
Yeah.
That I believe that at our essence we are compassion, and love, and spirit, and as we were talking, I was reminded of a speech that I gave to a Rotary Club about the book, about the burning. Mr. Rogers is a much more fun thing to talk about. But I was invited to this place called Cleburne, the Rotary Club, and Cleburne, let's just say it's not known as the most progressive place around. And I was really worried about how this was going to be received, how this story was going to be received. But I went, and told it, and you could have heard a pin drop.
Yeah.
Because it's stories.
Mm-hmm.
It's not me coming in preaching a theory or a philosophy or a political dogma. It's me telling stories about other human beings. Both are the ones who suffered, the blacks who suffered and the whites who demonstrated the humanity. I was shocked by the response to that. And I was so, I was so much more hopeful afterwards.
Yeah.
Because it's so much of it, don't you think? So much of it is in the presentation.
Yeah.
I'm not here to argue with you. I'm not here to hate you. I'm not here to shame you. I just want, this is the story as I understand it, or here's how I feel, and I would be open to hearing how you feel. And I hadn't really thought about this to the extent that before hearing you describe the power of the story, because I don't editorialize in that book.
No.
I just try to tell the story, and that's kind of all you need to do, I think.
So I have read since the George Floyd killing. I really made a concerted effort and decision that I was going to learn as much as I could. I had a good friend of mine who said Black history is American history, and I never thought about that before. And I've been learning stuff about our country. I never knew where was all this stuff. Right? It's important stuff. And I've read, over a dozen books and watched a bunch of movies and documentaries. All of them have been helpful. But I will say this, not because you're my friend and I'm kissing up. If people read one book and want to understand what's happening with race issues, it's The Burning. And because it's a story, a true story about who we have been, who we can be, both positively and negatively, and things that we can do to change that story for the better. And it is called The Burning. It looks like this. You find it on Amazon by Tim Madigan, Madigan. And as long as you're on there buying The Burning, you might as well buy your book on Mr. Rogers. And that was called?
I'm Proud of You. My Friendship with Fred Rogers. And I tell you what, after reading The Burning, I'm Proud of You might be a good palate cleanser, as they say.
Well, what I wanted to say to you was, in some ways, the book is the same kind of story, even though they're two very different events. But if you're willing to read it with eyes to see and ears to hear, what you're going to see in The Burning is awfully, of course, it's horrific. But it's a story of hope in that we can be better than that. And that's certainly what Fred Rogers was all about, calling out the better parts of us.
Right.
And I think that's what this book will do. For a lot of us, particularly to white people, it will call out, people say better angels. I'm not a big fan of that. It just calls out the better of us.
Right.
Because we've been introduced to a story where we see some of the worst of us. Right. And not just as white people, but as human beings. And also see heroic men and women doing great things for the cause of humanity. So in that sense, both of these stories have something in common. It's about drawing out the best in us in a world filled with a lot of brokenness.
Well, I think that maybe as I think about it again, I mean, the stories have something in common in that in both stories, there is a depiction of our human brokenness.
Yes.
And in both stories, I think that there are suggestions about how to transcend that brokenness.
Yep.
And with Fred being a model in the latter, there's a story I'd like to tell, and to just it's about just kind of anyway. I'll just tell it, and you can make it what you will. In 1996, I was assigned to live in a nursing home for 4 days.
Okay.
And it wasn't an expose. It was a good nursing home. I just wanted to know what life was like in a nursing home. So I got a roommate, and his name was Hal, and we became fast friends, and he would cheat at checkers and all that stuff. But anyway, I had meals with them, and anyway, my ritual every morning was that I'd go down the hall and say good morning to the people who lived there. Morning, morning. On the second or third day, I realized that in one particular room there were two old black ladies. I skipped their room twice. The second or third day, I caught myself. Why in the world did you do that? And I became aware of the fact that I was afraid of these two old white ladies or black ladies because they were different than me. And so I made it a point for the last few days I was there to stop in their room and say good morning to them. And what do you suppose their reaction was? The same as the white people, who with that very little attention just kind of blossom like flowers. Yeah. I never forgot that. And I think that as a result of my experience with this story, I'm somewhat more aware of my blind spots. But we all have them. Yeah. We all have them.
Well, I appreciate you telling that story because it certainly shows that you're not some goody two-shoes trying to cram a message down our throats. You're trying to figure it out like the rest of us. And
absolutely.
Through this book, it's just it's a powerful, compelling, provocative book, and I hope everybody will read it. It's called The Burning by Tim Madigan. And Tim, we so appreciate everything you've done for us at Community of Grace over this last year and a half or so. Your stories of Mr. Rogers that have inspired us. This story now that's going to challenge us and inspire us. And we're just honored to have you as a friend.
Well, and I'll even spend my own money to come out to see you, Tim, because it's been such a hard year. Yeah. I think of you and your people all the time.
Thanks.
And I want to be with you again soon.
Well, we look forward to it.
Okay.
Thank you, Tim.
Take care. Bye-bye.